All right, guys, so we're going to go through the MDU configuration of an rXg, and included in this configuration will also be Ruckus Virtual Smart Zone as well as Ruckus ICX. And the most logical way that I know to teach this configuration is to kind of step through the onboarding process one step at a time. And so basically, we're going to build the configuration. It's not the most efficient way to build the configuration. There's faster, more convenient ways to build the configuration. But for the purposes of teaching how to build this configuration, then what we're going to do today is just kind of run through the onboarding experience, and we're going to build the components that we need as we need them. So at the end of the day, what we're going to have is we're going to have the ability for an end user to associate to the start here SSID, and then they will be, what'll happen is when they associate, that'll send a radius request from the smart zone to the rXg. The rXg will respond with the VLAN. That client will get placed in that VLAN, and then the client makes a DHCP request. DHCP request goes to the rXg. rXg responds with an IP address. Then the client will make a web request. Typically there's like a connectivity check going on in the background. That will go to the rXg. The rXg will block that web request, and then the client will know that that request has been blocked, and then it'll pop up a micro browser, or maybe, depending on the device, it may just be their standard default browser, and it will present a portal. And through that portal, then they'll have the ability to register their account, and that includes things like adding your email address, adding a payment method if there's chargeable plans. And so in this lab, we're going to create a few different experiences: a free plan, a basic, a premium, and a business. And then we're also going to set the PSK. So in this particular case, the smart zone is going to use the rXg for external dynamic pre-shared key configuration. And so we'll configure that as well. And then once they've done all of that through the portal, they'll hit create, and they'll get assigned an account VLAN. So after the account has been created, then the client will move or associate to a different SSID, which would be called residence. And so that'll be this one here. And they'll be able to enter the password that they just created. And that's how that device and any other devices now from that point forward, since the account's been created, will get associated to their account, is based on the PSK that they enter when they're prompted when they try to associate to this residence network. With that, let's go ahead and get started, and we'll keep referring back to this particular chart as we go through this lab, and just to kind of keep track with where we are within the onboarding process. The first thing that's going to happen in this particular scenario is that a client is going to register, or connect rather, to the start here SSID. And the way that's going to be configured in the smart zone is it's going to be configured for MAC authentication, and there will be a AAA server profile, which will be the rXg. And so when they associate to that SSID, it's going to send a request through the smart zone to the rXg. And so now we need to do two things to get this configuration started. The first thing is we need to tell the rXg to allow that request to come in. And the second thing is once that request has been allowed to come in, we need to basically build a configuration with how to respond to that request. So everything with radius is going to be under services and radius. And then within services and radius, we have a few different scaffolds. So these horizontal sections of programming I'll refer to as scaffolds throughout the video. So if you hear me say scaffold, that's what I'm talking about. It's just one of these sections of configuration. So the radius server realm is where we're going to do the matching of the request to a particular set of instructions on how to handle that request. The radius server options is where we're going to allow that request to come into the rXg period. Like, do you want me to respond to radius at all from this particular device or not? So The thing that we need to do here is if we go edit this and we look down here at the bottom, there's this section called service visibility. And so we need to somehow figure out how to allow the smart zone to make radius requests. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to add the smart zone as an infrastructure device. So if I go to network and wireless and go to WLAN controllers and I hit create new, and we'll call this VSZ. And then we'll go to smart zone. And the host is going to be 192.168.5.5. So if I go look at my network topology, then 5.5 is the IP address for the smart zone, and the rXg has an IP address of 5.1 by default. And then there's a couple of places that I need to enter credentials. So all the default stuff here is set based on me setting the smart zone profile. And so then we're going to put in my admin password and then go down here and there's a Ruckus enable password. We'll do the same here and then I'll hit create. The biggest thing that we needed to have happen in this particular step is we needed it to create the policy for the smart zone, which wasn't there previously, and the IP group. So the way this particular section works is we have identities, policies, and then enforcements. And so the identity in this case is the IP address of the smart zone, and it has a precedence of 9, which is the highest level precedence that you can assign. So, if it matches like the default group and it matches the IP group, but because the IP group has the higher precedence, it's going to match to this policy. And that means that all the traffic for that particular smart zone is going to be handled by this policy. And so what we need to do is we need to go over to services and radius again. And now that we've added the smart zone, we'll go ahead and double check, but it's already added it to this policy because it knew what I was going to do. And it's already checked here. So we just want to make sure that this is checked. And what this is so service visibility is going to allow anything that's identified here. It can be external coming in over the WAN or internal coming in over the LAN. But anything that's checked here will have the ability to make radius requests. So now that those requests are allowed to come in, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create a realm that's going to answer that request. And the whole idea behind these realms is it's going to receive a radius request, and then it's going to look at how the realm is configured, and then it's going to do something like hand out a VLAN based on some credentials. It may hand back some attributes down here. So let's go ahead and configure that for our pre-auth request. And so when I say pre-auth, what that means is at this point, it's pre-authentication. We don't know who this user is. We don't know their password. They're setting up their account from scratch, so they're an unknown user, or they're a guest. And so you'll see me refer to this particular section of configuration as pre-auth/guest. And so if we don't know who they are, we refer to them as pre-authentication. And if we do know who they are, like they have an account or they're a known entity by the rXg, then they're referred to as post-authentication. So that typically means that they have a login session. So let's go back. We're going to create a new realm here, and we're going to call this pre-authentication guest. And the rank is asking, okay, so if there's multiple realms that could potentially match here, which one is going to take priority? And so the higher rank is going to take priority. And so what we're going to do is go ahead and set that to 2 for now. Once I get all the radius realms built, then we'll circle back and I'll explain to you why we set the ranks the way we did. But just know right now that, if there's multiple matches, the rank is kind of how it decides which one to actually use. So the next section here is request matching. And so basically what we're doing is we're going to look at the request that came in from the smart zone, the radius request that came in, and we're going to match based on something that's in that request that's unique, that's going to basically say, hey, based on this, and then in our case we're going to use the SSID. So based on the SSID of start here, I want you to do this. And so what we have to do is we have to create that match. And so I'm going to do that here by going down and setting the called station ID, BSSID. And then we're going to just type in here, start here, which will be our first SSID that we create. So we're going to use two SSIDs in this configuration because we're setting up, in addition to microsegmentation, we're also going to be setting up external dynamic pre-shared keys. And so an easy way, it can be done with a single SSID, but an easy way to kind of manage this is to have users, register their devices on a start here SSID, and then once they've got their account built, then they'll register, that particular device, and all their other devices will go directly to the residents. So basically, the start here SSID is just kind of a configuration SSID to get their account built. And then once they have their account built and they have their PSK created, then they'll go to the residence SSID, and then they'll stay on the residence for that device and all their other devices. So that's why there's two SSIDs configured here. So the first one is going to be start here. All right. So the next section here is dynamic VLANs. So what we're going to do in this section is we're going to hand out, based on the request that comes in, a VLAN. Now we can assign a VLAN per account. So that would be good in the case of an MDU, because each basically unit or each apartment or each dorm room could potentially have their own VLAN for all of their devices. So per account would be good for that. But in this particular case, we're still talking about pre-authentication, so we don't know what account to associate them with. So what we want to do is we want to do per device. And so what that means is that each device is going to get its own unique VLAN, or in this case, we're going to reuse VLANs in the event that we run out of the number of VLANs that are available. So let's talk about that for a second. So in a second, we're going to create the VLAN pools, and we'll also go through a feature called auto increment and auto increment ratio. But essentially what this means is, our gold standard is that we would, in an ideal world, we'd love for every device to have its own unique VLAN. So we call that a one-to-one relationship. But in some cases, wherever you're installing this particular solution, they may come back and say, look, I know you want 64 VLANs, but we only have 8 available. So can you make that work? And then that's when you have to do what we're going to do in this lab. And the reason we're doing that is to kind of demonstrate that capability. Is we're going to use those 8 VLANs, and then we're going to put 64 different networks in those 8 VLANs. And so in this case, that means that we're going to be required to reuse some of those VLANs from time to time. Now that's just going to be for pre-auth, but for post-authentication, we're still going to use that gold standard of the one-to-one relationship. So in this case, we want per device, so each device gets its own VLAN, and then we're going to reuse VLANs as needed. The defaults here are good otherwise. So the infrastructure device, remember I said, once their account's created, then we're going to switch SSIDs. The infrastructure, or this infrastructure device, would allow you to, if you're going to use a single SSID, it would allow you to send a COA, and then that client would drop and reconnect. And then the second time that they connect, they would probably pull down a different VLAN, because that VLAN would be the one that's associated to their account, and it would be per account instead of per device. So just know for now that infrastructure devices, you check those when you need to use a COA to have a device move from one VLAN to another automatically. We're not going to do anything with proxy, so we'll hide that. And then the default options are going to be okay here. And so these are the radius options, and essentially this is going to be what VLAN are we assigning to the client. And so these 3 attributes are going to be required to communicate that to the smart zone. And so we have those already attached to this particular realm. And so we hit create. Okay, so now what we've done, just to kind of recap, is we have the request allowed to come in, and then we're going to look at the attributes of the request once it gets past this section. And we're going to say, okay, I see an SSID of start here, and it's going to match to this realm. And then we need to assign a VLAN, but we don't have any VLANs created yet. So the next thing we need to do in this configuration now is go to Network and LAN. And in LAN, we're going to create some VLANs. But before I do that, I want to kind of explain these three scaffolds to you. This scaffold, Ethernet interfaces, is obviously what it is these are going to be your physical interfaces that are attached to the rXg in this case. In this particular section, so the physical interfaces, so now we have options of what we can attach to the physical interfaces. We can either attach VLANs or addresses. Addresses, so then this also is the concept of tagged and untagged traffic, right? So untagged would have no VLANs associated to it, and so we would use the address fields here. Tagged, if traffic comes in with a VLAN, so imagine the traffic's coming into this interface and it has a tagged VLAN, then it's going to say, oh, I see this tag matches, and then it's going to go down here to VLAN interfaces, and then associated to VLAN interfaces will be network addresses. Let me kind of say that a different way this time. So an interface can have either network address associated directly to it, or it can have VLANs associated to it, and then the network addresses would be associated to the VLANs. In the case of untagged traffic, network addresses would be associated directly to the Ethernet interface. In the case of tagged traffic, network addresses would be associated to the VLAN, and then the VLAN would be associated to the physical interface. And it is possible to have both tagged and untagged traffic on the same interface. So just like with a normal hybrid port or trunk port, depending on the manufacturer, you can have both tagged and untagged. So I could have, untagged go into my management VLAN, and then all my tagged traffic is going to go into whatever VLANs I create here. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and hit Create New, and we're going to call this Pre-Authentication Guest again. And I typically use that all the way through this side of the configuration so that you can associate, okay, that's the VLANs for pre-authentication, those are the addresses for pre-authentication, that's the radius server realm for pre-authentication. So everywhere you see that is going to be, where basically we're working on that pre-authentication side of the onboarding process. All right, so we have pre-auth guest, and then it's going to say, well, do you want to associate these VLANs to a physical interface? And we can do Q and Q as well, but we won't get into that in this video. But in this case, we're going to do just a physical interface. And so now this VLAN will be associated to VMX3 as tagged. So it'll show up right here when we get it configured. Now for this lab, we're going to set our VLAN ID to 1100. And then we have auto increment set up here. And what this is going to do is for every network address that gets created, then we're going to also create a VLAN. The exception to that is if there's a ratio. And so in this case, we're going to set our ratio to 8. And so what that means is that we're going to put 8 networks into one VLAN before we create another VLAN. So if I set this to 2, down here there will be an option to set auto increment to like 64. After we create the 64 networks, it's going to create a number of VLANs. If this is set to 1, then we're going to create 64 VLANs because it's a one-to-one relationship. If this is set to 2, then we're going to create 32 VLANs. So we'll put 2 in the first VLAN, and then we'll create another VLAN. In this particular case, for this lab, we're going to do 8. So it's going to put the first 8 networks into the first VLAN 1100, and then it'll move to VLAN 1101, and it'll create 8 more networks. And so all in all, in this pre-authentication stage, we'll be able to support 64 simultaneous clients, based on this configuration. Now that number can scale. This is just for a lab example to kind of demonstrate how this process works. But at the end of the day, we'll set up 64 networks, but they'll be split across 8 VLANs on the pre-auth side. And that means potentially 8 particular devices could be in the same VLAN, but they will be segmented at layer 3, and I'll talk about that more in just a second. All right, so we have pre-auth guest, VMX3, VLAN 1100. We talked about auto increment. Here's our ratio. We haven't built the addresses yet, so we're going to go ahead and hit create here. All right, so now we have those VLANs created. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to associate those addresses to the VLANs that we just created. And so the network that we're going to use here is going to be 10.0.0.1/30. Now at the /30, here's a couple of reasons that I'm doing that. One is there's exactly 64 /30s in a /24. So that's just divides that up, quite nicely as far as the math. And so basically I'm going to use this entire 10.0.0.1/24, but I'm going to divide it up into 64 /30 IP addresses. And so I'll show you what that looks like in just a second once we hit create here. So this is going to be our starting IP address. So what I have to be aware of is I need to make sure that if I hit 64, I need to know, essentially how many IP addresses is that going to use above this one, and make sure that that range is available. If it's already configured on the rXg, we'll give you a nice warning and tell you, hey, you can't do that because this will overlap with an existing pool. Okay, so we're going to create 64 networks starting at 10.0.0.1/30. Now the next question here is, do we want to create a DHCP pool? And yes, and so it'll create that automatically. And then the next question here is, do we want to create an identity for this group of networks? And so we do want to do that. And it says, okay, well, do you want to go ahead and associate that identity to a policy? Well, we can't do that yet because we haven't built that policy yet. So we'll circle back to that. So we'll stop here on the configuration, and we'll go ahead and hit create. And so now I haven't hit refresh on any of these scaffolds yet, but we notice here right off the bat that it's used that entire subnet. So 64 /30 networks here. If I hit refresh here, so the VLAN 1100 is now going to be VLAN 1100 through 1107. So all of these, basically all of these networks now have been divided into 8 VLANs. So 64 divided by 8, it's 8. And then if I hit refresh here, I now see that these VLANs have been associated, tagged onto VMX3. So any tag traffic that comes in or goes out will ingress or egress as tagged VLANs 1100 through 1107 if we want to use these pools. Okay, so that's all pre-auth. So I want to show you a couple of other things. First, we checked a box that said create DHCP pool. If I need to see that pool or edit that pool, then what I would do is go to services and DHCP. And under DHCP, I now see that I have the pre-auth guest pool, and the starting IP address is .2 because that's the first client IP address. .1 was utilized for the rXg. And then the ending IP address is going to be .254. So we have pre-auth guest, and so that whole pool is created. If I needed to do something, I can't do it in a /30, but if it's maybe a /24, if I wanted to reserve, like the first 10 IP addresses or the last 10 IP addresses, then I could do that here under reservations. We don't want to do it up here because if I change these numbers, because we're creating multiple networks, then I may just be cutting out entire networks instead of changing the pool, how the DHCP addresses are handed out. So that'll make a little more sense in this next step, which I'm going to show you. Basically what happened in the background. So in the GUI, you've created some very minimal configuration, right? So we created we did a network LAN. We clicked a few buttons on this front side to add some VLANs, and we clicked a couple of buttons to add, to specify the network that we wanted. It automatically created the DHCP pool for me. I didn't even have to click any buttons for that. So I want to show you what's happening in the background. So let's go ahead and let me open up Secure CRT, and then I'm going to SSH into the rXg. I've got another video that kind of explains how to do this. But now that I'm into the rXg, I want to do a couple of things. First, I want to type ifconfig, And I want to look at that first VLAN 1100. So now I see the first 8 networks. So they're /30, so they have 2 usable addresses, which is going to be .1 and .2. And then it has the broadcast address, .3. And then it also has the network address, which you don't see here, which is .0. So that was the first network. And then the second network would be .4 as the network address. .5 and 6 are the usables. And .7 is the broadcast address, and so forth. So there's 8 of those. And if I just do ifconfig, and I can see that there's been 8 networks assigned to all 8 VLANs. So that's the basically auto increment ratio and the auto increment section. So when we hit auto increment of 64, it built 64 network segments, and it split those across the auto increment ratio, which is the 8 VLANs, so 8 per VLAN that's been created here. The other thing that got created in the background, so that's a lot of typing if you had to do that manually, right? You have to type inet 10.0.0.1, That's a lot to type. So the next thing that also got done in the background is if I have it as a shortcut just to make it a little easier. But if I go look here, if I type in cat, etc., dhcpd.conf, now this will look familiar to you if you're a Linux guru, but don't edit this file because the rXg writes this file, and any edits that you do in here will just eventually be overwritten. So don't edit this file directly, but if you want to go look at it to make sure that everything was created right, if you've ever created DHCP pools manually, like through command line, then this syntax will look familiar to you. And so all of those networks that we created, so this is the 10.0.0.28 network. It has the broadcast address of 10.0.0.31, and DNS server, that's the rXg, is going to be 29. And then the range is interesting. It only has one IP address. So we created 64 DHCP pools in a matter of seconds that each contain one IP address. So at this point, we're going to look at our chart here. So we've gotten to the point where they can connect to the SSID, and then the radius request is going to be allowed into the rXg because we configured the radius server options. We configured a realm which is going to answer that request, but what we haven't done is we need to go to services and radius, as we haven't associated those VLANs that we just created to our pre-auth realm. So we're going to edit our realm, and then down here where it says dynamic VLANs, we want to check pre-auth guess. So now every device is going to go look in that pool of VLANs that we just created and hand out one of those VLANs. And then we'll go ahead and hit update here. Okay, and so now VLAN will get handed out. The next thing that will happen is that client will get moved into that VLAN, and then that client will naturally be making DHCP requests. And we've confirmed that we do have a DHCP server that is going to respond to that request. So now it's in VLAN, one of these 8 VLANs here, and so any of those will be answered and given an IP address in the proper pool here. And then the next thing that's going to happen is that client is going to make a radius request, and then that request, we need to do something with that, not a radius request, sorry, a web request. It's going to try to do like a connectivity check to see if I have internet access. And so we need to do something that's going to block that connectivity check. So in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to identify the users, and then we need to put them into an experience or a policy that will present a portal to them. So right now we're at this step. So users will receive an IP address, and then now we're on step 4. Users will be forced to a portal to create an account. So we need to do that piece. So if you'll remember earlier, we checked the box to create an IP group. And if we look at policies, the thing that we need to establish a policy is we need an identity, we need a policy, and then we need an enforcement. So in the case of what we're trying to build here is our identity is going to be based on the IP address of the user. Our policy is going to be pre-auth guest, just like we've used everywhere else. And then our enforcement is going to be putting a captive portal onto the policy that the user will, basically any user in that identity will get that policy. So let's go ahead and do that configuration. So we're going to go to identities and groups. And here is the pre-auth guest group that was created for us. One of the things that we're going to do here is we're going to change this priority to 5. And this kind of fits into a bigger picture that I'll explain later once we get all of the policies in place. But just like with radius on the policy realms, if I have multiple policies and I need to, and the client could potentially match multiple policies, then these numbers are priorities that will decide which one is going to win out. And in order for us to configure this properly, we need that group to have a precedence of 5. So I'll explain more once we get everything configured, and then it's easier to see why we did that way. All right, so we have the IP group, so now we need to associate it to a policy. And so we're going to go ahead and create a new policy, and we're going to call this pre-auth guest. And could be the default policy. Right now we have a default policy, so we'll just leave that. We don't have a splash portal built yet. That'll be our next step. And we can go ahead and put 100% bandwidth queue on here because they're not really going to get to the internet from this policy. So this is going to be our identity that gets associated to this policy. So you can see here there's multiple things that could be used as identities, but in this case, anybody that has an IP address from this block of addresses is going to go into this policy to start with. And so now if I click on policies again, then I notice I have a new policy, which is pre-auth guest, and right now everything would get straight out to the internet. So if I were to associate a device to the network, then I would get straight out to the internet in this case. So now that we have devices kind of funneled into this policy, this is our opportunity now to place a captive portal on this policy so that users then have to go see that particular portal page. So we're going to go to policies and captive portal. And under captive portal, we're going to go to splash portals and hit create new. And then we're going to just call this default splash. And the reason I'm calling it default splash is because we actually do have the ability to customize these splash portals. And we'd need to go create a portal page, and it would be available in this dropdown. So since we're not going to be doing that, I just want to indicate that we're using the default configuration for the splash portal, which is what this setting right here is going to be set for. So we have default splash, no portal mods, no attachments, nothing to be whitelisted. Background mode will be MAC. So this means that in the background, it will look at the MAC address of the device and see if it can associate it to an account. And if it can, and everything else checks out, then it will go ahead and automatically log in that device. And then for portal mode, we could do MAC, but I do MAC or cookie. So these are different ways that with the web browser open, that it can log in devices. So for some reason, background mode didn't happen fast enough and the browser did actually open. Then this would be the next step, is it's going to look for the MAC address or a cookie in the browser to establish that login session. And this will also log you into the portal. So you have options here where it can just create the session and not log you into the portal, or create the session and log into the portal. Or you can just disable automatic login altogether. Anyway, for our case, we're going to do MAC or cookie here. On the portal, if you wanted to offer password reset options, we can do that. We can have it use SMS for password resets as well. And this splash portal needs to be associated to the pre-auth guest policy that's coming in. So we want people that get that initial IP address and that initial pre-auth policy to hit this splash portal. And so we'll go ahead and hit create. And then if I click on policies again, I'll see now that this pre-auth guest has two enforcements. One is 100% bandwidth and the other one is the splash portal. And so the splash portal is what will prompt them for the login screen. All right, so taking a look back here at our current status, we have completed user will be forced to a portal to create an account. So the next step is we need to basically create a billing mechanism for users that want to subscribe to services. And in addition to creating these experiences, the free, basic, premium, and business, we also need to configure a way to collect the credit card information or payment information from the end users that wish to subscribe to those services. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. And the first thing that we're going to do is we need to go to Billing and Gateways. And under Merchants, I'm going to hit Create New. And there's two different types of gateways that we can use here. There's a direct gateway and an offsite gateway. The direct gateway means that the rXg is going to collect the payment information, could possibly store the payment information if this checkbox is checked. And we're going to send that payment information off to one of these many different payment processors. And then they'll authorize and give us an authorization back, and that's how that transaction is handled. The alternative method is to do an offsite gateway with one of these many payment providers. And we could do something like PayPal, which is what we're going to do in this lab. And then they can put their credit card information directly into the PayPal website. So the way that works is when they click payment, they'd be redirected to a PayPal business website and enter their credit card information. And then all we get back at that point is an approval to say they've successfully paid for services. And so we would get that approval back, and then they would be allowed services. So we don't store any credit card information with this method. The key difference in some of these plans that we're going to be building is that some of the plans you want to set up for a monthly recurring service. So for example, in an MDU, they might want to sign up one time on January 1st, say, and then when February 1st rolls around, instead of having to go into the website and put their credit card information in again, then they just may want to store a credit card on file and have that billed. And so we can do that with the direct gateway. In this particular lab, we're going to use a service called Authorize.net, and they have two different modes. And so you can use one for testing and one for production, but you would need to create an account with Authorize.net. And then if you want to use it just for testing, then you can click on this developers link and go visit Developer Center. And I believe if we do Hello World getting started, let's see. Yeah, this is what we want, this create sandbox account. And so once you create a sandbox account, you fill out all this information, then you'll get some information like, a login, a password, signature, that kind of stuff that can be used to actually allow the rXg to communicate with the Authorize.net servers. And so I already have that information, so I'm not going to do that. I just wanted to show you that you can do that as well. And you can test it. They give you some fake credit card numbers that you can actually put into the website and test and see, that the transaction goes through successfully and that your reports are generating and all of that good stuff. So what we're going to do is we're not going to do for this one just yet. We're going to do an offsite. We're going to do a direct gateway. I'll call it Authorize.net. Same here. We'll call this Authorize.net. And we do want to store credit card numbers for this payment gateway because we're going to set up some recurring plans. And then login information. Let me just grab that. And then you'll also have a password with this service. It'll look something like this. And then you'll have a signature, which they'll also provide in their portal. And then that would be there. Okay. And so those are the three pieces of information for Authorize.net that we need to have. And we'll go ahead and hit create there. And we're going to create one more payment gateway, which is going to be PayPal. And this isn't your standard PayPal. This is going to be business class of PayPal. So if I go PayPal business, PayPal for Business. So you would want to set up an account with PayPal Business and have that account linked to an email address. And then that email address is going to go into the login information here. So in my case, mine is linked to tcbrgnets.com, and feel free to add that to any of your production systems to send me all your revenue. You don't put a password in for this particular PayPal, so you just need that email address. So yeah, don't put a password in there for that particular service. And again, this doesn't work with PayPal Personal. It's PayPal Business that you need. And so that's all we need there. So we'll go ahead and hit create. Must configure an offsite gateway. Oh, I forgot to click here. So PayPal, there we go. And now we hit create. Okay, so now I have my 2 payment gateways. So let's go ahead and move on to the next step, which is going to be to go to billing and plans, and we're going to start talking about usage plans. All right, so let's take a quick second and let me give you an overview of usage plans, plan add-ons, time plans, and quota plans. So these plans are basically going to be a menu of options that the end user has the ability to choose to sign up for. And these plans are also what are going to begin to shape the user's experience. One other way to look at a usage plan is this is going to be a template that gets stamped to the user's account when it gets created. So the user is going to enter all their login information, first name, last name, create a password, create a pre-shared key, all that stuff is account details. But along with that, they're going to choose a plan, and that plan may be, hey, I want the ability to access 50 megabits per second, and I want unlimited download quota and unlimited time plan for 1 month. So those kind of things are what we're going to add into these plans. The plans always consist of at least a 1 time plan and 1 quota plan. So in the event that the time plan is not really going to be used, then you would use an unlimited time plan. Let me explain a little bit about what a time plan is, just so you don't get this confused with another reference to time that we're going to use shortly, which is going to be just the relative lifetime of the account. So this particular time plan, let me edit this one. Let's say this wasn't going to be an unlimited time plan and we were going to do 24 hours. So with 1 device drawing down on the 24 hours, if that device was online nonstop for a 24-hour period, then they would get 24 hours worth of usage. Now, if that one device only uses 1 hour and then turns its Wi-Fi off and doesn't use it, they could drag this 24 hours out for 24 days if they decide to use 1 hour a day over the next 24 days. So literally, they're purchasing a block of time and then they draw down on that time as they use it. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this is if they have multiple devices in their account. And so, for example, if you have 2 devices in the account and both of those are drawing down nonstop, then they're only going to get 12 hours because each device would have consumed 12 hours of the block of time. So typically, I don't see that setup a whole lot. Typically what people will do is they'll sell a day of access and they'll limit the number of devices, and we'll do that in a couple of the usage plans that we set up. In this particular case, what we're going to do is we're just going to set the time to unlimited, and then we're not going to set a charge for it or anything, so we'll just hit update there. All right, the next step that we need to do is we need to create the quota plans. And the quota plans are going to be how much data can the devices download in the account. And the same kind of rules apply. If there's multiple devices, then they're going to draw down on that data faster than if there is just a single device. So the first one that we're going to create for an example, and I'm going to do one with you guys, and then I'm going to use a template to configure the rest of them because anybody can push the buttons, and then we'll go back through those and I'll explain what each one of those did. So the first one we're going to do is called a 5 gig down, 2 gig up plan. And the price is going to be 0 because we're going to set the price in the actual usage plan. So you have an opportunity to set the price for the time or for the quota, or you can set just an overall time in the usage plan, which is what we're going to do. Then the next thing that we want to do is we want to do 5 gigs down and then 2 gigs up. And we're not going to do a rollover. So yeah, so we have now this quota plan that's going to give them the ability to download 5 gigs of data or upload 2 gigs. All right, so that is quota plan 1. We're going to create a separate those because if we go back, or a few of these, because if we go back, we're going to be creating the experiences for free, basic, premium, and business. So we need to create like all the different shapers and quota plans and stuff to go with all of these. So we're going to be doing that step by step here. So what I want to do though is, because I'm not a big fan of repetitive typing the same thing over and over again when I can do it in a template. So I'm going to give you, kind of show you how you can speed up some of this configuration. So if I go to System and Backup, and I go to Config Templates, I actually already have it in here for, this will be for quota plans. You can basically just paste in a template and that allows you to configure the rest of the system. And for me, it's easier just to edit this one text file than it is to click all of the buttons. So once I have this quota plan in, then I just hit apply. I could hit test first, and test will tell me that it worked. So summary success in test mode. So now I can go ahead and apply it. And now if I go back over and look at billing and plans, it's added the rest of my quota plans in. So I have an unlimited quota plan, a 50 gig down, 25 up, 5 gig down, 2 up, and 15 gig down, 7 gigs up. So those are my 4 quota plans. We have time plan, quota plans. Now the next step is to create the actual usage plans, which kind of brings everything together. And so one thing I wanted to show you on the usage plans, so if I go through here, it's going to ask me questions like, what are the max number of sessions that I want to create? What are the max number of devices? Maybe I want to do unlimited devices. And in this example, like this particular example, you can have, unlimited number of devices stored in the account, but at any given time, only 3 of those devices can have active internet sessions at the same time. So that's kind of how those settings work. But if I flip over here and go to identities and accounts, then under accounts, if I hit create new here, I'll notice that I have a lot of the same settings. So max sessions, max devices. So when I say that it's a template, what happens is when a user signs up for an account, then they'll select one of these usage plans, and that plan will then get stamped or copied to their account. And so if you ever need to make changes to a user in real time, like you want to increase the number of devices, you wouldn't go change that under the usage plan. You would go change that under the account to change it for an individual user. And then the next time that they renew their service or they change plans or do something like that, then if you wanted to edit it in the usage plan as well, then that would come down. So this template only gets applied when you manually apply it, or when something happens, like the monthly recurring charge comes up and it reapplies the plan to the account at the end of the month after a successful charge. Or maybe they choose, a new plan, then it'll go and stamp this plan to their account. But on a regular basis, as long as the account's not expired and it still has service, then the configuration that's in the actual account is what's governing their level of access. So hopefully that makes sense. So we're going to go ahead and we'll build one usage plan together, and then I'll use a template to add the rest of the other ones in. So let's go back to billing and plans. And we're going to create a new one here. And we're going to call this 1 day free. 1 day free, 5 gigabytes. And we don't have account groups built out yet. We do want to make this available on the splash and the landing page. We do want automatic login enabled. We do want to enable lock devices. And what this means is that once somebody signs up for an account, they can't go create another account. If their account runs out of the free plan, then they'll probably have to upgrade and buy a plan or something like that. So that prevents devices from just creating multiple accounts to keep using the free service over and over. Relative lifetime. So this is where we're going to say, since this is a one-day plan, then we're going to create, basically this plan lifetime is 1 day. So they'll be able to use this continuously until either the data expires, so they have a 5 gig quota limit, or until this timer expires, which is basically after they purchase, they get 24 hours. Let's see, so if we are going to check relative lifetime of 1 day, then that means the usage will expire, so I have to uncheck this box that says unlimited lifetime. Quota is going to be 5 gigs. Time will be unlimited. Max sessions will be 3 for this particular account. Max devices will be unlimited. And if I keep scrolling down, we're not doing static IPs. We're not doing optional add-ons. Then the question comes is, which billing gateway do we want this to use? And actually it doesn't matter because this is a free plan, so we'll just leave PayPal check there. No big deal. And recurrence, this isn't going to be a recurring plan. Okay, so that should be everything. Now if I hit create, sometimes it'll give me a validation error there and let me know what I've misconfigured, because there's certain things that have to be configured. Typically the most common thing that gets missed is when you select the relative lifetime of 1 day. If you don't uncheck this box, then it's going to give you an error. And that just means that you need to go back in and either change this to blank and leave it as never expires, or do one or the other. So that's the most common issue that I see here. So I'm going to go ahead and update. All right, so that's our first plan. And I'm going to step away here for 1 second. I'm just going to apply a template for the rest of the plans, and then I'll be right back with you. All right, so through the power of configuration templates, I've now added all of the usage plans, and we'll kind of run through those. There's some slight differences between each of them. So starting at the top, we have an on-demand 50 gig. So on-demand is kind of the key word here. Notice that this is a quota plan, and the interval is on demand. And so what this means is that the time, like these down here, will never expire. So this is set for an unlimited lifetime as long as they have quota left. So that means that they can buy that 50 gigs, and if they're only at this particular site maybe once a month, then they can drag this 50 gigs out. However, if for some reason they consume all 50 gigs and they need 50 more gigs within a month, then they could end up paying $50 as opposed to the 25 for the 50 gig plan here. So the on-demand just means as they use it, however long or short the amount of time is that takes. So the next plan is the 1 day 15 gig. So there's prices set for each of these. One is $25 for that plan, and then $10 for the 1 day 15 gig plan. Nothing special there. It's 15 gigs down, 7 gigs up, and has a lifetime of 1 day. Then there's a free plan for 1 day, and no interval on that. And then there is a 1 month basic, so you get 25 gigs of service, 50 gigs of service down, 25 gigs up for a month. And then there's a business class plan, which has unlimited time and quota for $150 per month. So those are the different tiers of service. Now, one thing that we usually add to the usage plans, and this is what kind of configures what policy the accounts are going to be added to, kind of helps shape their experience, is an account group. And we don't currently have account groups built out, so that's going to be the next step. And if I go look at my policy map, so we've built the plans, those are going to be configured to the accounts, but now we need a way now to tie those accounts to a policy, and the way we do that is through account groups. So account groups are identities, and then we'll have a policy that matches each of our identities, and then we'll start to put enforcement on each of those policies to further shape that user's experience. So let's go ahead and go to identities and groups. All right, let's create a new account group. This one will be called free, and it will be the 1-day free plan. I'll create another one called basic. And 2 plans are actually going to get you to the basic account group. The first being the 1-month basic, and then the other one being the 1-day 15 gigabyte. Then we'll hit create new, and then the next one will be premium. And that's going to be the on-demand 50 gigs. And finally, we'll create one more account group, which is going to be the business class. And that'll be the 1-month business class. And then from there, so now we have identities built. So now we need to build the matching policies for each of these identities. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and click on policies here. And under policies, we'll hit create new. We're going to create a premium policy. And associate the premium identity account group. Hit create. And then we will hit, the next one will be the free plan. Associate that to the free identity. Hit create. The next one will be the business plan. Associate that one to business. And then last but not least, we will need the basic policy. And we'll associate that to the basic identity. And now if I go hit policies, we'll see now that we have the premium, free, business, and basic, but we don't have any enforcements on there yet. So we're going to go ahead and add those enforcements now. So let's start with the subnet filters. So we're going to go to policies and packet filters. And what a subnet filter is it prevents communication between subnets. So right now, anybody in the free plan can talk to anybody in the premium plan and vice versa. So what we want to do is to attach those policies to the subnet filter, and that will prevent them from reaching anybody that I attach to the subnet filter will not be able to talk to any other subnet but their own subnet, which is what we want for all end user facing policies, which is going to be the basic, business, free, and premium. And while we're at it, we'll go ahead and attach pre-auth guest because we don't really want them talking to anybody either. And we'll hit update. And so we now have the subnet filters added there. The next thing that we want to do is, we've got 2 things that we could do. We could add the landing portal, or we could add traffic shaping. I say let's go ahead and add traffic shaping first. And what traffic shaping is, so we're going to go to policies and traffic shaping. And what that is that allows us to set the maximum amount of bandwidth that a particular client or account, depending on how we configure it, what's the maximum amount of bandwidth that they can consume at any given time. So right now, everybody's using this 100% policy, or at least the default and pre-auth guest policies are. And so what we want to do is we want to build a few more traffic shapers or bandwidth queues to be able to limit, to shape the experience for the different levels of service. So like on this one, we're going to do the normal process here where I'm going to create one with you, and then I'm going to use a config template to add all the rest of them. So we'll go ahead and hit create new under bandwidth queues. And the first one we want to do is we're going to do a 3x1, so 3 megabits down and 1 megabit per second up, with burst. And so what the burst means is that for a certain amount of seconds, whatever we define here, we will override whatever the default traffic shaper is and give them faster speed. For example, most of the web traffic that you see is to websites or something that requires loading on the front end. And so, for example, if I wanted to go to CNN.com, most of the work is done within the first couple of seconds. So if I set the bursting for the first couple of seconds, then it'll seem at a higher speed, then it'll give me the ability to load web pages faster. But then my sustained rate for that particular user will be lower. It'll be the 3x1. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and set download rate limit to 3, upload rate limit to 1. And then we're going to do a burst upload of 2, and then we'll do a burst download of 10. And we're going to do that for 5,000 milliseconds or 5 seconds. And so for the first 5 seconds of the connection, they'll get 10 megabits per second down, and then after that, it'll drop down to 3. So that'll allow stuff to load faster, and then once everything's loaded, then it'll throttle them back to the slower speeds. And then this is actually going to be the experience for the free policy. And this is going to be based on the device. Okay, and that looks like everything that we need for that one. So I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of the bandwidth queues via a template, and then we'll talk about those as soon as that's done. Okay, so now I've added those via a template. And so we'll take a look at the different ones that we've created. So we have 100% shaping, which we already talked about. And then we have a 20x2, which is pretty straightforward, 20 megabits down, 2 megabits up, no bursting. Then we have the 3x1, which we created together with a 5-second burst at 10x2. And this is per device shaping. And then there's per account shaping. So the difference between the shaping is that each device in an account, in this particular case, will get 3 megabits per second. Whereas in this configuration, the account will get 20 megabits per second. So if there's only one device, that one device will get 20. If there's two competing for the bandwidth, then each device will get 10 megabits per second and so forth. So depending on the number of devices, that'll get split up across the account. Then we have 50x2, no burst, no guarantees. And that's account shaping. And this is for the different policies over here. And then finally, we have a 50x2 with a guarantee of at least 10x1 megabits per second. So only use guarantees if you absolutely need them, because it is possible to really saturate your uplink with guarantees. But this basically, where everything else is using fair sharing, this creates unfair sharing, such that we're going to guarantee that the business class users are going to get a minimum of 10x1 megabits per second. All right, so the other thing that I wanted to point out, so we have these visual images up here, so you can kind of see how the traffic shaping has been added. So here's my one uplink. If I had multiple uplinks, it would show both uplinks here. And then I can see the different traffic shaping policies here. So I could have and I can layer these on top of each other. Like I can have a per device traffic shaper, and then also have a per account traffic shaper on top of that. So these are showing, so this is a per device traffic shaper. These with the ones in the middle are per account. And then we can have per policy traffic shaping going on here. And then we can have, a limit set at the uplink. Which reminds me, right now, the default for the uplink is 100 megabits per second. If for some reason that's, you need to adjust that, like you have a circuit that's a gigabit per second, then you can just go to Network and WAN. And then under this uplink, we will just hit Edit. And this can be, we'll just change this down to 1 gigabit per second. And this may tell me my license won't support that, but we'll see. Oh, no, we're good. And then if I go back to policies and traffic shaping, I see that my uplink has now been updated to a gig. So if you want to get an idea of the traffic shaping policy for every policy, then you can take a look here. And then the other thing it's going to do is if you click on the word policies and go look at our policy map, we'll notice that the free has the 3x1 with the burst. business has the 50 by 2. So now we're starting to visually see what the experience is going to be for all these different tiers of service. The last enforcement that I want to add right now is going to be the landing portal. So under policies and captive portal, we're going to create a landing portal, and this will be the page that people see once they have logged in. So pre-authentication, they'll see a splash portal. Post-authentication, they'll see a landing portal. And so under the landing portal scaffold, we're going to hit create new. We're going to call this default splash. And for now, we're going to leave most of this as default. So we're going to associate all of the post-authentication policies that end users can find themselves in once they've logged in. So this will be the basic, business, free, and premium policies. And we'll hit create there. And if I go look at policies again, then default landing, and it highlights all the policies that are associated to that. So, and that's one thing to point out too, is that if you want to see what the user's experience is, you can highlight any section of this, and it's going to highlight all the associated records. So for example, for that landing portal, it highlights the basic, business, free, and premium. So I know by hovering my mouse over that everything in red is associated to that landing portal. If I want to see what the premium experience is, I can just hover my mouse over that. And if for some reason this is really complex, this policy map, which it can be sometimes, you can just click on the word premium, and then it will take you and isolate you just to that policy, so you can see what just that policy looks like. All right, so that is going to complete this section with enforcements. And so let's move on to the next section. All right, so let's go ahead and take a second. We're going to revisit our original plan to see where we are. So we have users will connect to the SSID. That'll be on the Ruckus side. So we'll configure that here in a little bit. Users will receive microsegmented VLAN. We configured all of the pre-auth and IP addresses and VLANs, and we assign those to the radius realm. So that's how when they connect to the SSID, radius request goes out. We respond with the pre-auth VLAN. They get an IP address. We added the captive portal, the splash portal, so that they get redirected to actually create an account and select a plan. And at this point, we've completed building out all of the plans that they have to select for. And we actually went one step further, and we configured all of the post-authentication account groups, which are how they get into their policy. So let me go back and kind of show you what we did here just to recap. So if we go to policies, so pre-authentication, they're going to come into this policy, and then they'll end up on the splash portal. They select a plan and create an account. And after they create an account, they're going to have one of these identities now. This is considered post-authentication. And so post-authentication starts with the account group identity, and then it has these enforcements, and then it also ends up with a landing portal. So landing portal is for post-authentication, splash portals are for pre-authentication. So based on their IP group, they get into this pre-auth policy, and then once they have a post-auth IP address, then they'll no longer qualify for this pre-auth, and they'll be logging into a separate SSID, so they'll be getting an account group assigned, and that will be their identity at that point, and that puts them into these policies. So in order to get into this policy, again, pre-auth, we're basing this based on the IP address to put them into this policy. After they log in and have a login session, then it'll use the account group of their associated account to determine what policy they're going to be in. So just wanted to kind of touch base. I know we did a lot of things in those last few steps, but most of that was defining the user experience. And so now, looking at my list of things that we need to do still, we've just got a couple more things to take care of, and then we need to do some cleanup to make sure that everything has a policy. But one of the big things that we need to do is we keep calling this pre-auth guest, but so far we haven't really done anything for a guest user. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. We're going to go to identities and shared credentials. And then we're going to create a shared credential group. And by default, what happens is it'll put a form on the Splash portal to allow you basically the option of entering a specific code to onboard onto the network, almost like a token or something like that. But in this case, we're going to use a special code in this field called free. And what that does is that will actually create a button on the Splash portal. Let's see if we can take a look at the Splash portal. We're going to go ahead and open this up. And if I do that with no redirect, the reason I'm getting this page is because we don't have a Splash portal on the default policy. So what I'm going to do is go back to, we'll open a new tab, just so I don't have to close this tab out. We'll duplicate this one. And if I go to policies, I'll find the one that's selected default, which is the default one, and it doesn't have a Splash portal. So actually, I don't really need this default policy, because the idea is with the rXg is you want everything to have its own unique policy. So for our case, we don't need a default policy. We're going to define a policy for everything so that nothing actually hits that default policy. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And then I'm going to make the pre-auth guest policy the default policy. And so now if for some reason there's not a policy defined, then they'll be in this pre-auth guest policy by default. And so now I should be able to go back and hit refresh. And now I see the landing page. This is the splash page. And notice right now that the only option we have is to create login. We don't even have an option to log in. And the reason is it knows that there's no accounts on the system, so it's not going to give you a login form because there's no accounts that could actually log in. So this page is dynamic, and based on the configuration that you make within the rXg, this page will update with your proper forms and so forth. And an example of that is going to be when we add the shared credential group here in a second. We'll see another button pop up here. And while we're here, I'm just going to go ahead and hit the create login button so that I can show you kind of what the login form looks like. So the user would then go and enter their account information here. They can select the plan type, which are the plans that we selected. And if I select one that's chargeable, then it'll start asking for credit card information. So then if I do, I think the 1 day free was PayPal. Yeah, so this one maybe. Yeah, so this one uses PayPal, and then all the other ones are going to use, and notice on the PayPal one, it doesn't ask you for the credit card information. So that was a difference. So if I go to 1 month basic, it asks for my credit card information. Whereas if I go to PayPal, because we don't store the credit card or we don't have any part of actually, processing the credit card, we don't even need to know the credit card number in this case, because we're going to redirect you out to PayPal, and then PayPal will redirect you back and send us, an approval. So you'll have, so at that point you'll be able to get service. So anyway, so that's what our configuration is looking like so far to the end user. And then of course they get details, what the capabilities of their plans are, so they can sit here and shop, figure out which plan they want, and then they'll purchase that plan and it gets applied to their account. All right, so for now, we're going to go back and we're going to do the shared credential group. And so this group we're going to call free. And we're going to make the precedence on this 6. And when we get everything configured, we'll go through and review all the precedents so that I can show you, why different things have different precedents. So we have the free policy, so that's going to create the button. This is going to associate to our free policy, and then the time that we're going to allow for the usage minutes is going to be 1 hour or 60 minutes. We're not going to set a download quota or an upload quota. We're going to make these unlimited, but we could if we wanted to. But since it's only for an hour, we'll let them do whatever they want to do within an hour. And then I have the ability to set how long is this credential good for. So by default, it's good for a week starting today. And so what I'm going to actually do is expand that to a year and a week starting today. And this is not going to be a recurring plan. And let's see. unlimited users can use this particular credential, the free one, at any time. And then the intersession timer. So what we're going to do with the intersession timer is actually tell it that it has to wait 24 hours between uses. So if they get their free hour by clicking the button without actually creating an account, then they can, once that hour expires, then they can only use this plan once every 24-hour period. So that's what the intersession timer is going to be for. Okay, and that should finish our shared credential group. And so we'll go ahead and hit create there. And so now we have that. And if I go look at policies, I now have the account group if they choose one of the free account options, or if they choose just to click the button, then they'll come in under this identity, which is the shared credential group. And the reason that this is higher than the pre-auth guest is because they don't actually leave that pre-auth guest network. So when they're using the shared credential group, they stay on the pre-auth IP addresses and VLANs, so they'll stay completely isolated. They don't get an account or an account VLAN. And so in order for that to actually work, we had to make sure that even though that they had an IP address that qualified for pre-auth guest identity, that this identity had a higher precedence so that they got moved out of this policy, which had a splash portal on it, into the free policy, which does not have a splash portal. So that's kind of an explanation of, a good use case of how the precedences come into play, because in this case, they're not moving out of this IP group, but they needed a higher policy once they got signed in. So that's where this is going to come into play. And so then the last thing that we'll do here is we'll take a look at our portal. I'm going to hit refresh. And now we have a button here that they can just click to say connect, and then that'll put them immediately online without having to create an account for 1 hour. And then after that hour, then they have to wait another 24 hours, and then they can use that credential again and get online for another hour. So, all right, there's the shared credential groups. And so let's take a look and see what else we got left to do here. All right, so we're going to jump back and take a look at the plan here again. So we're done with all the way up through 5. And I went ahead and added guest on here. I did not have that on there previously. So we've also defined the guest onboarding experience. And I have an option 6 here, which is basically kind of walking me through what happens from a user's perspective. So they'll also need to set their PSK. And then in the virtual smart zone, we'll set up an SSID that will use external dynamic pre-shared keys. So now the next thing that they would do as an end user is switch SSIDs. So they would go from their start here SSID, and now they're ready to join the residence SSID because they've done everything up to this point and included creating a password that would get them onto the residence's SSID. Now they have 2 options on how they can get onto this SSID. In the portal itself, for the end user, they can scan the QR code that will basically tell their device to connect to that SSID, and it automatically enters their credentials for them. Or they can just go and associate to the SSID. It'll prompt them for a password, and then they enter that password. And so now what we need to do is we need to start looking at the post-authentication experience to make sure we have everything defined there. And just like with the pre-authentication experience, with post-authentication, it starts with a radius request coming in. So it needs to know, okay, I have a user. what VLAN do you want me to put that user in? What network address is that user going to get? So we're starting that whole process all over again. The controller's already allowed to make inbound radius requests, so we don't have to worry about that piece of it. But the next step that we have to do is we have to create that radius server to receive the post-authentication radius requests. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create new here, and we're going to call this Post-Auth accounts. So the next thing that we need to do here is, in this case, we are going to associate policies. So what's going to happen is, based on the password that the end user enters, the VSE and the rXg are going to exchange information, and basically the VSE is going to check in with the rXg and say, hey, do you know this password? And we've got a list of accounts, and we're going to check against that and say, yes, we know that, and that device belongs to this account based on the password that they enter. And so once we've made that association, now we have this account, basically identity. And so that account identity, as we learned earlier, ties them to their account group identity, and that account group ties them to a policy. And that policy is what's going to associate them to this radius realm. And so for post-authentication, instead of using like the SSID, we're going to use the policies to associate them to the proper realm. So in this case, it'll be either the basic, the business, the free, or the premium policies that will associate them to this realm. So we're not going to do a match, so we're not matching based on the SSID here. The dynamic VLAN is going to be assigned per account now, because now this is post-authentication. So all the devices that join will get one VLAN per account in this particular configuration. And we have not created the VLANs yet, so we do need to do that next. And so if I keep scrolling down here, so we're not going to reuse the VLANs in this case, because everybody's going to have a one-to-one, as we talked about earlier. And the rest of the defaults are going to be okay here. Infrastructure device, we're going to select that in case a COA needs to be sent for any particular reason. And then we'll scroll down here. Now there is one additional parameter that we need to assign here, which isn't assigned by default, which is the eDPSK radius attribute. So this is what's going to allow us to pass information back and forth with the VSE regarding eDPSK. So not only are we going to send the VLAN back, but we also have this eDPSK field that also needs to be populated here. So go ahead and check that box for Ruckus eDPSK in this example. And then we'll go ahead and hit create. Okay, and so now we've created the ability for the request to come in, and now it's looking to assign a VLAN. So we need to go create the VLANs and the IP addresses and the DHCP addresses again for this particular section for post-authentication. So we're going to go through that process again. All right, so let's navigate back to network and LAN. And we're going to pick up with the next VLAN. So we're up to 1107 here. So the next one we're going to start with is 1108. So we're going to call this Post-Auth. And I call it Post-Auth accounts. So it kind of tells me these are authenticated accounts that are going to be using these VLANs. And VMX3 is my, if I go back and look at my interfaces here, so VMX3 is actually this interface here with my management network untagged, and then all my tag traffic will be on VMX3. So that's the physical interface, VLAN ID 1108. And we're still going to do auto increment, only this time we're going to set the ratio to 1. Last time we set it to 8, but this time we want that 1-to-1 relationship. And we'll hit create here. And then to create the addresses, we'll do Post-Auth accounts again. Change the VLAN that we're associating these addresses to Post-Auth accounts. And then for the addresses, we're going to do 10011. That's correct. And instead of /30s, though, we're going to do /24s so that they can get more than one device in this subnet. Auto increment, just for this example, we'll do 110. And this can be really based on the number of accounts you expect to have. You want to have that one-to-one relationship. Span is not needed, and we do want to create a DHCP pool. And we do want to create an IP group. And we have not created the policy for that IP group to be associated to yet, so we'll stop there. And we'll go ahead and hit create. And then just like last time, if I go to services in DHCP, I'll see that I have the Post-Auth accounts here. And if I go to identities and groups, I'll see that I have the Post-Auth IP addresses here, just like with the Pre-Auth. So now we need to associate this to a particular policy. And so let's navigate over to policies. And yeah, we'll just click on the word policies. And we're going to call this policy Post-Auth landing. And we're going to associate the IP group Post-Auth accounts. And go ahead and hit create. Now let's go ahead and create the landing portal for the Post-Auth IP addresses. So we're going to go to policies and captive portal. And then under landing portal, we're going to call this Post-Auth landing. And then the login method will be MAC or cookie. We'll also enable background mode, which is going to be MAC. And then this will get associated to the Post-Auth landing policy. And then we'll go ahead and hit create. So now if I go back and click on policies, we'll just make sure that that's followed all the way through. And ideally, nobody will ever end up in this Post-Auth policy, Post-Auth landing policy, because if they do, what that means has happened is that they've somehow gotten an IP address for the Post-Auth VLANs, but they don't have a login session that's moved them into one of these policies. And so what's happening in the landing portals, we're looking at either their MAC address or a cookie in the browser if they happen to have that open and logged in. But we'll look at both of those and try to build a login session. So that's what's going to happen here is, if for some reason they find themselves with an IP address but not a login session, then they'll end up in this policy, which will essentially create that login session for them to get them into their proper policy. So now that we've done that, let me go ahead and go back to services and radius. And under the Post-Auth accounts now, we want to tell it to hand out the Post-Auth VLANs. So when that radius request comes in, it's going to pull a VLAN from this pool of VLANs and provide that back, and then the client gets moved into that VLAN, and then they make a DHCP request, and then they have an IP address, and then based on their login session, they'll get moved into the appropriate policy at that point. All right, guys, so we're getting close to having this configuration for the MDU complete. So what I want to do is we need to go back and just clean up a couple of things that I either forgot or I wanted to save to the end, just to make sure that this config is complete and to the best practices. So first thing we want to do is I need to go back to policies and captive portal, and we want to edit the default landing. And in the default landing, we're going to change this portal mode to MAC or cookie and the background mode to MAC. And that just gives it the most flexibility with trying to automatically log in devices that may not have a login session already. So we'll go ahead and update those and click update. The other thing while we're here is on the Splash portal is under the whitelist. So we used a payment gateway called PayPal, and in order for us to be able to redirect users to PayPal, we need to whitelist the PayPal service. or the PayPal website. So I'm going to add that in there. And then it's also good to have, this is in here by default, which is the certificate validation host. That helps with making sure that, the web browser has the HTTPS. Go ahead and update on this one. The next thing I want to do is create, so if I go to identities and groups, this is just kind of a good thing to check when you're getting close to wrapping up a configuration. So our goal here is to make sure that every IP address has an associated policy. So we don't want somebody to have an IP address and then not be assigned to a policy. And so the way to easily figure that out is if we look at the addresses box here, then we can see down here that Post-Auth accounts has already been assigned to a policy. Pre-Auth guest has been assigned to a policy, but this management LAN has not been assigned to a policy. So we want to go ahead and do that now. And we don't have a policy created for it yet, so we'll just create the management identity. And then we'll go and create the policy to match that. And we normally want to assign this a higher precedence. So we're going to put that up somewhere around 8. And then let's go ahead and create that. And then that'll make sure that now that we have all IP addresses are assigned to a policy, so that default group that we deleted earlier won't be an issue. And so now let's go to policies, and then we'll create a new policy here. We'll call that management. We'll go down and assign our management IP group. Then the last thing we'll do here is we'll just go ahead and assign it to the 100% bandwidth queue and hit create. All right, and we'll go ahead and do that for the VSC as well. So I'm going to edit the VSC policy and assign that to the 100% and hit update. And let's take a look and see what else we got here. So I'm going to click on policies to refresh this map. So we have Post-Auth landing, that looks good. What I want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and assign Post-Auth landing to the subnet filter and hit update. And then let's look at block subnet. So if I click policies again, that'll refresh. That's one thing that's really good about this visual map is it's easy to go in after the fact and see, okay, does everything look complete? So just my infrastructure devices are not being blocked from subnet to subnet traffic, so that's okay. And we have management, VSC. Okay, that all looks good. Okay, looks like there's one more here that does not have traffic shaper, which is Post-Auth landing. So we're just going to go and find that policy, edit it, and then we'll put it on the 100% as well, and click update. All right, so it looks like we're down to about 3 final things that we want to do here, and in no particular order. So since we're on the policy page, one of the things that we're going to do is go to policies and persistent caching. And the rXg has a web cache that's built in by default. And if you're not using it, then it's a good practice to go ahead and delete that. And so I'll just click delete there. And then if you are using it, that's great. You can just attach it to whatever policy you want to use it for. But if you're not going to use it, just for best practice, go ahead and delete that. Then the next thing that we want to do is if we go to System and Portals, is we're going to use the web proxy capability of the rXg to allow inbound access so that I can access the GUI of the smart zone that's behind the rXg through the rXg. And the cool part about this is it actually leverages the SSL certificate that's on the rXg. All right, so the way that HTTP virtual host works is I'm going to go ahead and create new. And I'm going to put in the domain that I've created ahead of time. So this is going to be lab1vsz.rxg, and I'll show you this in just a second. .ninja. I'm just going to copy that. The name of this record and the host name don't have to be the same, but for me it makes it easy. And then if I go look at my network topology, the VSC is sitting back here at 192.168.5.5. So I'm going to go ahead and point this record to 5.5, and then the smart zone listens on port 8443, and it is going to be using HTTPS. So what's going to happen is I'm going to hit this domain lab1vsz.rxg.ninja. It's a CNAME record that points back to lab1.rxg.ninja. Then lab1.rxg.ninja has an A record that points to the public IP address of the RXG. And so basically what that means now is that this table will do a translation between that incoming request and route the traffic to whatever private IP address and whatever port I specify. So the request is going to come in on 443, and then we're going to translate that to 5.5 and port 8443 on the back end. The other benefit here is that I'm going to be using the same certificate up until the point of the RXG that I used for the RXG. So I have a wildcard certificate configured, so I can use any subdomain. And so now I'll be able to browse to this address at 5.5 and have it translate and get me to 5.5 on port 8443. So I'm going to hit create, and then we're going to go ahead and test that out. So I'll just copy this, and we'll throw that in a browser. And notice I didn't have to put the :8443 or anything, and then I'm right here at the login page for the Ruckus controller. And so you can do that with any number of subdomains. So I have, one for VRiot, I have VMs. So basically I can get to all of these different systems behind my RXG with just typing in these domains. The other interesting part about this is I'm not exposing the actual IP itself. So like if I did a one-to-one NAT, then that opens that IP address up completely to the internet, and it also allows it to be an attack surface for your installation. So instead, what's happening here is somebody actually has to know this full FQDN in order to gain access to that port translation from 443 to 8443. If they don't know the FQDN, it's not like they can just scan the RXG and scan and find this particular subdomain. These are pretty cool little tools to have, especially if you have web servers or configurable items behind the RXG. It just makes it really easy to gain access to those. All right, guys, so for the last couple of things that we want to do is I want to go ahead, now that we have the configuration in the RXG complete, I want to integrate the smart zone as well as an ICX switch so that we can push and pull data from those two devices. The cool part is that we can take the config that's already built in the RXG and push that out to like an ICX. So like for example, under network and LAN, we have all these VLANs that we're using, and those will need to be configured on the switch. And once we use configuration sync, then we'll be able to push all of these VLAN creations to the ICX. So we'll take a look at that as we're building that out. So first, let's start with the smart zone. So we're going to go to network and wireless. And we already have the record for the smart zone, but sync is not enabled. So we're going to go ahead and enable sync. And enable config synchronization and click OK. All right, so the config is in sync. All right, so the next thing I want to do is I'm going to pull up kind of in a side-by-side screen here. We're going to pull up the actual controller so that we can see that the actual changes that we are making are pushing out to the smart zone. Let me put in my correct password. See if that works. Okay. Yeah, sure, let's update that password. All right, so if I go look in Smart Zone and look under wireless LANs, shouldn't have any. Oops. Okay. And so we just have the default zone, no wireless LANs. And if I go look at network and access points, I have 2 access points, which are reflected here, and 1 zone for those access points, which is the default. All right, so a couple of things that I want to point out that are just slightly different that may cause a little confusion. But so we have access point zones. That's pretty much a straight translation to access point zones over here. So default zone, default zone. Within the default zone, we have access point profiles, which in Ruckus is called access point groups, whereas we call them access point profiles. So if you want to create a new group in Ruckus, then you would create an access point profile in the rXg, and then zones is a direct translation. So that's how you would nest, your WLANs and your APs into different groups using those scaffolds. We're going to stick to the defaults. So, but I did just want to cover that briefly. The other thing that you'll probably notice here on my screen is that you'll see this field here switching between orange and green. And all that means is that it is, when you see the orange and the green toggling, is that it's checking the configuration to see if there's any changes that need to be pushed, or it may be pushing changes. So you'll see that change status immediately after you make a config change here so that it pushes over to the virtual smart zone. So that's completely normal. Don't worry about that. So what we want to do here is we want to create, I'm essentially going to create 3 WLANs. And this one we're just going to call Lab 1 Management. And the access point zone that this is going to be a part of is going to be the default zone. The SSID is also going to be Lab 1 Management. And then we're going to put a WPA2 on here, no MAC authentication bypass. So this is just going to be a straight WLAN, no frills, just WLAN that drops, users into the native VLAN. So essentially this is what I use for management. If I want to jump on to this SSID, then I can get into my management network and manage all the devices that are associated to that. And then I'll do a pre-shared key for this one, and let's make it password 123. And we're not going to tunnel. We're going to do this on both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, and VLANs doesn't apply here. So we'll go ahead and hit create. Access point default AP profile unknown is not a member of zone default zone. So what's happening here is I don't have a default AP profile built on or as part of a zone. So I could do one of 2 things. I could either go down here and edit this record and add it to the default zone, which I'm fine just using the default that's built into the smart zone, or I could delete this record. Not delete this record, sorry, uncheck this box, which is what I'm going to opt to do. So now we know, because see those brackets that are empty right there? That's what it's complaining about. It's saying you're trying to put this into a group, but that group's not assigned to a zone. So we're going to use this one over here, which is actually assigned to a zone. So we'll hit create. And then what I should see is at the top, it may have already done it. Let's go to network. Oh, there it goes. Network and wireless LANs. And there's my SSID. And then that will start broadcasting across all my APs in the default group. So that's pretty cool. All right, so we have a couple of other WLANs that we're going to add here. We have one for our lab management. I'm going to go ahead and hit create new. And we're going to create another one. This is going to be for our residence network. So if I type residence here, access point zone we're going to use is going to be the default zone. The controller is a virtual smart zone. We're going to uncheck the default AP profile and just use the one that's built into the Smart Zone. And then for policies, we're going to attach this to the free, premium, business, and basic. And so these are going to be all the policies that could potentially be used when somebody associates to the residence network. So remember, this is post-authentication when they attach to the residence, because they're going to need, down here, we're going to configure external DPSK. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to configure our side, and then the rXg is going to go configure external DPSK on that WLAN. So we associate these policies because those are the potential post-authentication policies that it could be a part of. And then for VLANs, it'll be post-auth accounts. The SSID here is going to be the same that I've created, so that'll be residence. And then encryption will be WPA2. Authentication will be multiple PSK. We're not going to use a pre-shared key because it is going to grab that from the account profile for each user. We're not tunneling. We're going to use both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz radio. The radius realm server is going to stay as the local radius realm server. So I think we're good here. We'll enable accounting. That's always good to have. And that should be it. So let's hit create and see if we get any validation errors. No validation errors. And so now we'll see this SSID come over to the VSE, and then we'll take a look at how that is actually configured. Okay, there it is. I'm just going to wait for this to go back to a green status, just so I know that all the config changes have been made. And then we'll take a look at how that's configured. Okay, so now we're good. Hit refresh. And then if I go look at residence, hit configure. So it went in and it standard usage, authentication type. So open authentication, WPA2. And then this is the other part that's kind of critical if you're configuring this manually, is the dynamic PSK is set to external. So that's going to point it to the rXg, which it automatically built the authentication server and the accounting server here. And so it's already pointed, it's already grabbed the shared secret and added that to the profile. We turned on accounting in the profile, so it turned it on here. So all of this has already been configured for you with just by simply adding this WLAN with those few clicks that we did there. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this because I don't need to make any changes. So we configured the post-authentication SSID, but remember we're going to have two SSIDs, one for them to register their accounts and then one for them to actually use on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to create what's called a start here SSID. Start here. Access point zone will be default. And then this one we're going to leave wide open. And here shortly, once we get this config done, I'll show you why we can do that. That nobody will get internet access. So as far as they can get on this SSID is going to be to the portal. Even if they authenticate, they won't be able to get past it to the internet on this SSID. They have to move to the post-authentication SSID in order to do that. So the SSID we're going to copy here is start here. Nope, that's policies. SSID, start here. So for policies, this is going to be pre-auth and guest. And start here, encryption, none, authentication, none. Actually, authentication, we're going to do MAC authentication. So that's what's going to send the radius request to the rXg to collect the VLAN that we're going to assign for pre-authentication. And so we have that. Pre-shared key we don't need. We could put a pre-shared key on there. It's just another step that the user would have to go through to get onto this network. So I'll leave that up to you if you want to do that. We're not going to be tunneling. We'll use the local radius server. And then for the VLANs in this case, we're going to use Pre-Auth and guest here. And then I'm going to turn accounting on as well. And so now we have our start here SSID. Go ahead and hit create. Always catches me. So hit create. And there we go. So now we have all of these SSIDs created. And if I go look over here, okay, so it's syncing right now. And then once that sync is complete, I should be able to hit refresh here and see that SSID. Okay, and so here we have it. Start here. We'll go ahead and do a configuration on that. And it's open, just like we expected. It's using MAC authentication, so it's proxying those requests through to the smart zone. This is important because if the radius requests are coming from the AP versus the smart zone, then we would need to make a configuration change in the rXg. And just real quick so I can show you that, if we go to services and radius, and go over to down here to radius server options, if you'll remember earlier, this is where we added the virtual smart zone as far as visibility. But if you think about the access points, they're all going to be in our management network, and they could come from any number of IP addresses. So what we want to do is allow, if the requests were going to come from the management network, we would just check that box to allow anything in the management network to make radius requests. But in this case, we don't need to do that because everything's being proxied through the smart zone. Okay, so that is done. And now the only thing left to do for this configuration is to test to make sure that we can go through the entire onboarding process. So we would associate to the start here SSID, and I'll do that here momentarily. Okay, so now we're going to set up config sync for the ICX switch, and that is done under network and wired. And so I'm already on that screen. It's going to refresh just because I clicked that again. All right, so what I'm going to do here is hit create new. And this switch is default. The only thing that I've actually configured on this is the IP address and the password. But I do want to show you something that's pretty cool. So if you're not familiar with the switch that you're integrating with, but the rXg is, then the rXg will actually generate the config for you, the bootstrap config. So we have the Ruckus ICX switch. I know the IP address is, actually I'm going to put in the wrong IP address, just so it'll generate the config. And so, and the default username is this, and put in password. And there's no enable password configured currently, so go ahead and hit create. So what it's going to do now is it's going to try to see if it can connect to that switch, and if it can't, then it's going to let me know that it's offline. And when I hit this button that says sync not enabled, then it says, hey, you don't have communication. You probably need to apply some config to the ICX switch itself. Maybe the password that you have in the switch doesn't match. So for example, if this was a truly default switch and I hadn't set the password, then it would ask me to put in like the sp-admin, which is the default password for the ICX switch. It also wants to know what the management port is. Which port does the rXg connect to the switch? That way it doesn't, do anything that will impact communications there. And so when I have all that configured, then I can hit this button, download bootstrap config, hit save. Let's go ahead and open that up. And so now it's generated the initial config. So for step one, it wants me to go enable config terminal, system max VLAN 4095, write mem, exit, reload. So it wants me to reboot and basically expand the number of maximum VLANs for the switch to 4095. Then after the reboot, it wants me to run this block of commands.
And so this includes setting the IP address. Now, the actual switch IP address is .30 that I've already configured for it. But because I put 31 in the profile, it's telling me this is how you configure, .31. It's also telling me how to configure the password that I want. So I don't have to know anything about configuring an ICX switch, and the rXg is going to generate, this script that I can just drop into that switch to kind of bring it to a state that we can do the config sync. So that's pretty cool. And there's a number of switches outside of ICX that this works for. In this case, we're going to be using ICX as an example. And I'm actually going to change this back to 5.30. And then once it sees that that switch is actually there, we'll get a little green check mark there. And then this functionality will change what happens there. So see, it's already queried the switch. It knows the model number and the version number. And while that's happening, I'm going to go ahead and SSH into the switch so that I can show you that it's actually in default, and then we'll watch it as it builds the config out, which is pretty cool too. So this is going to be 192, and I'm SSHing from the rXg. So I've logged into the rXg, and then from there I'm just jumping into the switch. .5.30. Oh, so it knows the switch existed previously. I just defaulted it for this lab. So I'm going to do rm/.ssh. Oh, no. So I'm going to remove the known host file. And then we'll try it again. Okay, yes. And then the password will be that. Okay, so now I'm logged in. If I do show running config, then there's not a whole lot of configuration on here. So there's no VLANs configured. It's just basically a default switch with an IP address and a password that's been configured. All right, so we'll leave that there for a second, and we're going to go ahead and enable sync over here. And so now when I click this button, because I have that green check mark, it has it's prompted me to do a backup, but since there's nothing on the switch, I'm not going to worry about a backup. And then the next thing says okay, we would need to do a comparison between the config on the switch and the config in the rXg. So we'll give that a second to run here. And now it's generated a diff between what I have configured on the rXg and what's configured in the switch. So mostly some port naming issues. So it wants to name all the ports, it wants to configure the radius server. All seems like pretty reasonable stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and enable config synchronization and click OK. Now you can uncheck this box if you don't want it to write memory. That way, all you have to do is a simple reboot to get your old config back or something like that. Okay, it says configuration is now in sync. Running config saved to startup config, and nothing to output. All right, so now we have the ICX switch in configuration, or in synchronization. So now if I do, let me SSH back in. So now we should see the names that it was talking about. So those names have been synchronized across, but still no VLANs or anything like that because we have not yet added any configuration to the switch that includes VLANs. So what we're going to do now is go up and create profile, and we're just going to call this profile trunk port. What we want to do is we want to select
the ports. So if I scroll down here, I can see my APs are hanging off of ports 1 and 2. So I want both of those to be a trunk port. And then the other port that I need to find is my uplink port. And that is, so I can see here the link neighbor is VMX3, which is my rXg. And so that's 1148. So I'm going to also attach this as a trunk port. And next 25, 1148. All right, so I have those 3 ports. And then untagged VLAN, I'm not going to change. I'm not going to shut down the port. Tagged VLAN. So now this is where, with just a couple of simple clicks, I'm adding all those VLANs that I created. Nothing else to add here, so I'm going to hit create. And then if I go look, let's go back to page 1. Let's just look at, there we are. So all of these now have been assigned to my trunk port configuration. So now if I go look at the switch config, so now we can see VLANs have been created. So I've got VLAN 999, 1100. So that was my first, these were my first 8 ports. And I have all these ports configured. Those are all the VLANs that got added. Okay. And just showing the configuration name. Okay. Yep. So we can see there by looking through that config that, you know, all the VLANs that were here, and now I can go and edit those VLANs and it will push those changes to, and now I'm just demonstrating one switch, but imagine if this was, you know, 30 switches or 20 switches even. Then it's pushing these config changes out to all of those, so it's keeping everything exactly in sync. So if you create a new VLAN, it immediately gets propagated out throughout your entire infrastructure, which is really cool. So the last thing that I want to do here is I want to create a switch port profile for users. So yeah, so we're just going to set up port 1110 for MAC authentication by selecting that here, and then we'll hit create. And so now we have this port, and now when a user plugs into this let me refresh that so it shows. When a user plugs into 1110, it's going to send a radius request over to the rXg. And so that reminds me, one thing that we need to do to make sure that that works sufficiently is go back to services and radius. We want to make sure that the ICX can actually send radius requests. So I do see that it was added to my policies that are allowed to send radius requests. And then the other thing that I need to do is make sure that it's added to my infrastructure devices so that those COAs are also sent to the ICX as needed. So I'll go ahead and hit update there. And we'll edit here. Update there. So now if the end user, because it's one port, we're not switching SSIDs like we are in Pre-Auth, then the COA will be more necessary here. And what will happen is once they create their account, then they will receive a COA to the switch that disconnects that device temporarily. Then when the device reconnects, it'll do MAC authentication again, and then it will get joined to the same VLAN that the wireless clients are on for that account. So everything will be synchronized all the way through. Okay, so we have that. The other thing I want to check is to make sure that my infrastructure device, so we're going to go identities, groups, is associated to an appropriate policy. So we have the ICX, and it's created its own policy for Ruckus ICX, which is okay. So we're going to go now to policies, and I just want to make sure that policy is then connected to like a traffic shaper. So we have the VSC, Ruckus ICX. So what we're going to do is we're going to edit the ICX policy and select 100%, and then click Update. And now if I refresh the policy screen, I see that I have my ICX IP group and my VSC. Now I could do something like create a policy that was just called infrastructure and point both of these groups to that policy, but this way it's created automatically. I don't really need to do anything else, and this is completely fine. So one additional piece of configuration that needs to be added for MAC authentication bypass to work on the ICX switch is we need to add a radius server realm specifically to answer those requests for pre-auth. Post-auth, we can leverage the existing radius realm, but for pre-authentication, we need to create basically what I call a wired pre-auth, and I misspelled guest, so we'll correct that. Wired pre-auth guest realm. And in order to fit this into the policy, one of the things that we need to do is we need to change the rank of the existing two policies. So if you'll remember previously, this was a rank of 0 and this was a rank of 2. And now we're adding a new 0, and then we're going to have a rank of 2 and a rank of 4 for pre-auth guest. The reason these need to be a different policy instead of using the same one is because we're looking at different attributes, and it has slightly different functionality with the way these are working. So first of all, no matter if it's a pre-auth request or a post-auth request, all radius requests are going to come from this IP address for the switch, which is 192.168.5.30. With the wireless radius realms that we created here, they're going to switch SSID. So at a certain point, the SSID will no longer be start here, so it'll no longer qualify for this rank. And we also have this rank set to the highest, so that if somehow they do end up on the start here SSID, they never get out of a pre-auth state, which means that they're essentially forced to move SSIDs in order to get internet access. Whereas with wired, we need that to operate a little bit differently. We still need that differentiation between ranks. So we have 0 and 2, but we need the post-auth to be a higher precedence than the pre-auth here, so that even though the NAS IP address is still 5.30 up here, now you have two potential realms that could answer that request, because they may have a login session that puts them into one of these policies, and they may have an IP address of a NAS IP address of 5.30. So we needed the precedence or the rank here to kind of help clear that issue up. And so we'll take a look at the wired realm. And so simply called wired pre-auth guest. I thought I corrected that. There we go. And rank is 0. No policies associated because we're matching based on the NAS IP address that's coming in the radius request. And so the switch IP address is going to be 192.168.5.30. The VLANs, this is a pre-auth pool. So each device is going to get its own VLAN. And then still need to use reuse because pre-auth has the auto increment ratio. Infrastructure devices, technically I only need ICX on here, but in this case, there's no harm in adding VSC, so I just do it, make sure that all infrastructure devices are on all radius realms is kind of my rule of thumb. But it's not 100% necessary. You could drill down on that and just do the wired infrastructure devices for wired realms and wireless for wireless. And then as far as the rest of the configuration here, we're just going to use the default. And then in your case, you would hit create, but in my case, I'm just going to cancel, or I'll hit update so that it updates the spelling in that word. Pre-auth guess. Okay, finally. So yeah, so that's the radius realm that we need to answer. And that way when the device connects now to the switch and plugs in, so it plugs into that port, a radius request is going to be fired off from the switch to the rXg, and this is the realm that's going to answer it. And we've already have the ICX switch down here from an earlier step to be able to receive that request. So now once we receive it, we need to figure out how we're going to process it, and that's this step here. All right, so now we have the ICX. So I think the only last thing to do is to test all of the configuration that we've done at this point. So let's move into that phase next. All right, we're going to test this out, make sure everything is working correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and change SSIDs, and we're going to go to the start here SSID. There's my Splash portal. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create, login. Address isn't required. I'm going to do a free plan. And first name Terrell, last name Boyer. And we're going to go ahead and purchase that. All right, now that I'm logged in, I'm going to go to devices. And if I wanted to, I could just scan this QR code with any additional devices. So for example, I'm going to, right now the devices that we see up here are going to be just my Mac, but I'm going to take my iPhone, go to camera, scan the QR code, and hit join. And then if I go look at my settings, I now see that I'm on the residence network, and if I scroll back up to the top, I see that my device has been listed here and has an IP address. And so that was just by scanning the QR code. So if I want to join with this device, I'm just going to copy this password, and then I'll go over to, now you can update the password here as well, but in my case, I'm just going to copy it. We're going to go to the residence network. It's going to prompt me for a password. And then actually my iPhone is asking if it wants me to share the password, so I'll say, sure, why not? There we go. And so now I've gotten 10023 on my 10021/24. So it looks like everything is working. The only last thing I want to test here is to make sure that I have internet access. And so if I go to cnn.com, I do have internet access. So it looks like everything's working for our onboarding experience. And if I go, let's take a look here. We'll go log back into the lab. If I look at identities and accounts, I see that my TCP account has been created, and I have these two devices have been added to it. And then my VLAN, Post-Auth VLAN is 1109. Eventually this 1100 will fall off. And if I search, let's see what policy I'm in. Yep, there we are, account group free. And so I have a 3x1 rate limit with a 5-second burst to kind of load those pages a little faster. So let's go to fast.com and see if that's in fact the case. Yep. Got up to 10 megs, and now it's throttling back. Yep. So it'll probably stop before I get all the way down to 3 megs, but it did burst me to the 10 megs for the first few seconds, and now it's throttling me back down to, ultimately it'll be the 3 megs per second. All right, so it looks like that's worked. So the last thing to test is we're going to test the wired port on the ICX switch and make sure that that works. So if I go to network and wired, just want to verify which port we configured again. So that's going to be port 10. So I'm going to go plug into port 10 and we'll see how that process goes. All right, guys, we're going to go step by step through the onboarding process for a wired device. So over here on my screen, we'll have some radius information, including which server is answering the request and what tag is assigned. Watch the DHCP request come in, and then we'll also be able to see if there's a COA that gets sent here. So they'll kind of test the onboarding process through that port 10 that we worked on earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in my wired Ethernet adapter to my iPad. And so the first thing we should see is a radius request come through. It's 3 minutes after. Yep. So we see wired pre-auth guest answered and signed VLAN 1101. And then the next thing we should see is a DHCP request on VLAN 1101, and that'll be after 1503. So we'll see that come down here. So 1504 at this point. Okay, and so we got a DHCP ACK on VLAN 1101. So I'm going to jump over to the iPad. We're going to log into an existing account. And sign in. And so we should see COA get sent, which we saw the COA got accepted here. New radius request, we got VLAN, so this is Post-Auth accounts, and we got VLAN 1112, and now the next thing we should see is a DHCP server request on VLAN 1112 for a Post-Auth IP address. And so what this is demonstrating is that through a single port, just by logging in, I was able to move from pre-authentication to post-authentication. There's my discover and my ACK on VLAN 1112. So now, if I go back to the iPad, if I go to cnn.com, then I'll have internet access. And so it looks like everything's working on the ICX side. All right, guys, so with that testing complete, everything within this lab example that we've created appears to be working properly. So with that said, what I wanted to do was to go back through and just kind of do a recap of everything that we did just in one quick sweep, just to kind of touch on, all the different places and all the different reasons we put everything into place. So starting at the policy map, or actually I'm going to start at services and radius, because if you remember, the first thing that happens is the user will associate to an SSID, and that SSID was going to be called start here. And so what we're doing in the radius realms is each request that comes in, we're having to look at the attributes, all the different attributes that come in a request, and then we're matching those attributes, whether it's the SSID that's in the attribute or the NAS IP address, or maybe it's not matched on necessarily the attributes that are coming in, but it could be matched on which policy the devices should be a part of. So in pre-authentication, we're matching on attributes. In post-authentication, we're matching on, do they have a login session, and is that login session associated to the same policy as a radius realm? And in the post-auth accounts, that's what we're doing. So, and then the other thing to point out is that we have ranks over here. So the radius server realm ranks are basically, the highest rank is going to take precedence. And so the way these are set up is we have the wired pre-auth based on the NAS IP address of 5.30, which is the switch IP address. And so that's the lowest precedence. We have post-auth, which is higher than that. So you always want the precedence to be, or the rank to be different here, so that if a device was to change radius realms, then it will send that COA. If there's the same rank, then that will not happen. So with different ranks, then it'll recognize that the VLAN has changed and that there's a COA that needs to be sent. So in order for us to use that one single port like we just did in pre-auth and for post-auth, then we need to have those ranks different. And then the reason we have pre-auth guest here the highest is because if somebody's on this SSID, we want that to be the highest precedence, because we don't really ever, if they're on start here, we don't want them to get internet access. And so every single time a radius request comes in, they're with start here as the SSID, then they're going to go into this realm and they're going to get a pre-auth IP address. And if we go look at the policy, that policy has a captive portal on it. And so that captive portal is going to prevent them from getting out to the internet. So that's going to be this pre-auth guest policy here. So then the next thing that we're going to look at is, so the incoming request comes in, they get, so it matches. So let's go back. I kind of got sidetracked there for a second. So under service radius, so tracking the incoming request. So we're going to start here. And so they associate to that SSID. We look and say, okay, we're going to give a VLAN out of the pre-auth guest pool. So if we go network and LAN, we have pre-auth guest VLANs. And remember, those were /30s, not subnet sizes. So that means only one device per subnet. So there's two usable IP addresses, one for the rXg and one for the client device. And so we created 64 of these pre-auth networks. Now, in my experience, typically when you're setting up these deployments for production, your pre-auth guest is typically about 25% of whatever your post-auth guest is. So in this case, we're doing about 50%, but in a production environment, you may consider using, so if you have, let's say it's an MDU and it has 100 units, then you might want to have 25 pre-auth pools available. So about 25% of whatever the total unit count is. And so for post-auth, those are typically, based on the number of units in an MDU, and obviously you probably want to have a few extra, so a little bit of overhead just in case. And then whatever that number is will help drive the pre-auth number, which is going to be about 25%. All right, so continuing on, so you get a pre-auth VLAN, you get a pre-auth IP address. The next thing that happens is that pre-auth IP address is associated to an IP group here. And so if we look, we have this pre-auth IP group, and it's associated to the pre-auth addresses, and it's attached to the pre-auth policy. And so then if I go look at policies, then my identity is going to be based on my IP address, and it's a low precedence. It's a precedence of 2, but it's higher than default. But either way, default puts me in there as well. And then that puts me to the Splash portal. And so at the Splash portal, then I'm going to log in. And when I log in, I get a login session. So let me see if one of those are created. So I can go to Instruments and Device Sessions here. Okay, and so this account's logged in, and this was the iPad that we just did. And within this login session, so let me just search on this MAC address. It's associated to the TCP account. And so what we're looking for is we're looking for an account group, which is going to be our post-auth identity. And so we have this group here of free. And I can also see when I search the MAC address of the device, this could also be the IP address of the device, then it highlights with active what policy is currently enforced. So currently it's in the free policy, and it's based on the free account group, which is based on the billing plan that we created that says if I sign up for a free plan, then we're going to assign the free account group, which is right here. So I signed up for this plan. This information got stamped to my account. And so now I'm going to draw down on, the 5 gigabits of service that I get in one day for free. And so my account group is set to free, which ties to my policy. And then there's also a post-auth radius realm, which is the higher rank. So that means that there's going to be a COE sent, a new radius request is going to come in, and then it's going to pull a VLAN from the post-auth VLANs. And here I can just click and see that scaffold. I don't actually have to go to network and LAN. And so my VLANs for this are going to be 1108 through 1217. And it's 1 tag per subnet, so that means we're isolating at layer 2 and layer 3. And then we have post-auth addresses, and this is going to be a /24 subnet. So that means that one account, I can have 253 devices, like one for the gateway address, and then 253 other devices that can consume IP addresses. And so that is the post-auth section. We also created another identity called a shared credential group. That credential group we used a keyword called free, and that's what puts the little button on the website that says, go online. You don't have to enter any information. If you wanted to do something like ask for an email address, then you could associate a question down here with that shared credential group and force it like this is required. And so then you combine the pressing of a button with the request for an email address, and they have to fill that in order to proceed. So those two kind of work hand in hand. Let's see what else we have on our policy. So that's our guest user policy there. And so just looking at the precedent, so we have post-auth accounts. So we created this policy because there could exist a world where my device possibly hangs on to an IP address, and it maybe, it got set statically, or, maybe my DHCP server on my device just didn't release it. But if that happens and I end up in a post-auth account or a post-auth scenario, but I don't have a login session that puts me into one of these higher precedences, then it's going to basically use a landing portal to automatically log me in based on my MAC address or a cookie in the browser, depending on how we have it configured. So in this case, we're looking at both, either a MAC address or a cookie in the browser. So if that happens, if we should end up in this policy and not yet have a login session, then that login session will get automatically created based on just this information here. Once I have a login session, though, since these are higher precedences, then I will move into these policies and have these enforcements. And then my infrastructure devices are always going to be the highest precedence because I don't want them, to be blocked behind a splash portal or anything like that. Typically, those are going to go straight out to the internet and just have an isolated policy. And I could combine, the ICX and the VSC into this management policy and clean that up a little bit. But this is the way it comes up by default. So I just wanted to have it look as close to what it would look like as you're deploying this. Let's see if there's anything else to cover here. Nope, I think that is just about it. We've covered, pretty much all of these policies and why they exist. And this is a good MDU deployment to start with, and you can modify this as you see fit. Now, a couple of other things is if you go to the help section and you go to the lab manual, then the majority of everything that we did in this video is going to be covered in this lab section here. So everything from adding licensing, which was actually a previous video that I did, that should also be available to you, and adding the public IP address, the initial system config, LAN. So all of this, gateways and plans, content filters. We could do interstitial redirects, anything that you want to know about. So the video is going to cover the majority of this, but not 100% of this. But I can guarantee you everything in the video is going to be covered somewhere within this lab manual. And so the idea behind the lab manual is, if you want to take another pass at it, is you could follow this lab manual and set up another lab example that's a little more robust than what we've created here in the video. It's got some content filter policies and stuff like that built into it. But yeah, so that information, or those labs, are available here. And then a couple of other resources to point out. So if you are working through a system, and let's say we're in network and LAN, and we're working and we don't exactly know what one of the fields means. So let's say physical interface. I mean, everybody knows what that means, but I could hit help, and then it's going to give me a brief help section here just by clicking the help above the scaffold. And then if I need more information, then I can click display full manual page. And then that will take me to the LAN section of the operation manual. And you'll notice that the operation manual is laid out exactly like the menu structure of the rXg. So we have system, network, services, identities. And then in the manual, we have system, network, services, and identities. So it's very easy to browse. And then again, if you need an example of how to set up a system, use the lab manual there. If you're working with the API documentation is going to be listed here. So lots of resources available for you. We also have our YouTube channel with YouTube videos, content available, as well as Reddit. And then you can ask any type of questions that you want to ask there, and the community of people that install rXGs will be available to assist you. And then, as always, you can reach out to us here at RGNets. So guys, I know this has been a really long video. I hope it has been informative for you, and that this was helpful. So good luck to you, and let us know how we can help. Have a good one.